The night air had left a lingering chill on her skin as she made her way to the nurse's station, where a harried-looking charge nurse barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Dorson, you're on 5 West tonight. Room 507 needs special attention. Post-cardiac, stable but requiring monitoring." The words came rapid-fire, clinical, leaving no room for questions or hesitation. Leona nodded, her brown hair tucked neatly beneath her scrub cap, and gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency. 5 West was the cardiac ward, a place where life and death played their eternal dance to the steady beep of heart monitors and the whisper of oxygen machines. As she walked down the corridor, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the freshly waxed floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. Room 507 was at the end of the hall, partially hidden in shadow despite the harsh overhead lighting. The patient chart indicated Paulo Oliveira, 68 years old, admitted 3 days ago following a myocardial infarction. As Leona approached, she could see him through the half-open door, a thin, elderly black man whose dark skin seemed to have taken on an ashen quality under the institutional lighting. "Good evening, Mr. Oliveira," she said softly, entering the room with a warm smile. "I'm Leona, and I'll be your nurse tonight." Paulo's eyes flickered open, deep brown and filled with a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. His fingers, resting atop the standard-issue hospital blanket, twitched slightly in acknowledgement. "Evening," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. As Leona began her initial assessment, checking vital signs in 4 lines with gentle precision, she noticed the little things that spoke volumes. The absence of get-well cards, the untouched water pitcher, the way Paulo's gaze darted anxiously toward the door whenever footsteps passed by. In her years of nursing, she had developed an instinct for patients who needed more than just medical care. Those who needed an advocate, a protector. "How's your pain level tonight, Mr. Oliveira?" she asked, noting the slight grimace that crossed his face when she helped him adjust his position. "It's manageable," he replied, though the tension in his jaw suggested otherwise. "And please call me Paulo. Mr. Oliveira makes me feel older than I already am." Leona smiled, making a note in his chart. "Paulo it is then. Don't hesitate to tell me if you need anything for the pain. That's what I'm here for." As she continued her assessment, she noticed other details that raised subtle red flags. Slight bruising around his foresight that seemed excessive, patches of dry skin that suggested inadequate basic care, and a general air of resignation that seemed out of place for someone whose condition was improving according to the charts. The night shift stretched ahead, long hours filled with rounds and responsibilities, but Leona felt an unexpected connection to this quiet man in room 507. Perhaps it was the way he thanked her with genuine gratitude when she adjusted his pillows, or how his eyes lit up briefly when she took an extra moment to explain the medications she was administering. "You're different," Paulo observed suddenly, as she was checking his oxygen levels. "The others, they just come and go, like I'm not even here." The comment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Leona paused in her work, meeting his gaze directly. "Well, I believe every patient deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It's not just about the medical care, it's about being seen as a person." Paulo's eyes welled with unexpected tears, which he quickly blinked away. That's good to hear," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. As Leona finished her initial rounds and prepared to move on to her other patients, she felt a growing sense of protectiveness toward Paulo. Something wasn't quite right in room 507, and her instincts, honed by years of experience, were telling her to pay attention. "I'll be back to check on you in a bit," she promised, adjusting his blanket one final time. "Try to get some rest, but remember, if you need anything at all, just press the call button." Paulo nodded, settling back against his pillows, but Leona couldn't miss the flash of anxiety that crossed his face as she turned to leave. Walking back to the nurse's station, she began reviewing his chart more thoroughly, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might explain the unease she felt. The night was just beginning, and already Leona sensed that her temporary position at Vora Medical Institute was about to become far more complicated than she had anticipated. As she sat down to document her observations, the fluorescent lights continued their relentless buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows in the corners of the ward. Something was stirring in the sterile corridors of 5 West. Something that would test her professional boundaries, her moral compass, and ultimately, her courage to stand up for what she believed was right. The night deepened around Vora Medical Institute, the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. Leona found herself returning to Paolo's chart again and again between her rounds, something about the neat, clinical notes niggling at her consciousness. The medication times seemed oddly spaced, the dosages technically correct, but administered with what appeared to be deliberate delays. She'd seen enough patient charts to recognize when something was off, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on what. Around midnight, the ward settled into that peculiar stillness that marked the deepest part of the night shift. Most patients were asleep, their rooms dark except for the gentle glow of monitoring equipment. The overhead lights had been dimmed to their nighttime setting, creating pools of shadow between the harsh fluorescent circles. Leona used this quiet time to catch up on her charting, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she documented her observations. A sudden movement caught her eye, a tall figure in a white coat striding purposefully down the corridor toward room 507. Even from behind, she recognized the confident gait of a senior physician, someone used to commanding respect. The doctor disappeared into Paolo's room without bothering to check the patient's chart or speak with the nursing staff, breaking basic protocol. Leona frowned, minimizing her documentation window. She didn't recognize this doctor from her brief orientation, but something about his behavior set off warning bells in her mind. Rising from her station, she moved quietly down the hallway, telling herself she was simply doing her job by monitoring all activity in her assigned rooms. As she approached room 507, she heard voices, or rather one voice, speaking in low, clipped tones. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried clearly enough. Dismissive, irritated, lacking the professional compassion she would expect from a physician speaking to a vulnerable patient. She paused just outside the door, her hand resting on the frame. The hospital's ethical guidelines were clear about patient advocacy, but she was also acutely aware of her status as a temporary nurse. In her experience, temporary staff who asked too many questions often found their contracts mysteriously shortened. A sharp intake of breath from within the room made the decision for her. Leona stepped forward, rapping her knuckles lightly on the door frame as she entered. "Good evening, doctor. I'm Nurse Dorson, assigned to Mr. Oliveira for this shift. I noticed you came in to check on him and wanted to update you on his latest vitals." The physician turned, and Leona found herself facing a man in his 50s, his silver hair perfectly coiffed even at this late hour. His name tag identified him as Dr. Sebastio Perez, head of cardiology. His expression, momentarily startled, smoothed Chu Ickley into professional neutrality, but not before Leona caught a flash of something else. Annoyance? Contempt? "That won't be necessary, nurse," he replied, his voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent. "I'm quite familiar with this patient's case." He emphasized the word familiar in a way that suggested Leona's presence was not just unnecessary, but unwelcome. Paolo lay silent in his bed, his face turned slightly away from both of them, but Leona could see his hands gripping the blanket, knuckles white with tension. The monitoring equipment showed an elevated heart rate. Not dangerous, but certainly indicating distress. "Of course, doctor," Leona responded smoothly, moving to check Paolo's 4 line with deliberate casualness. "I just wanted to mention that his last set of vitals showed some interesting changes. Perhaps we could step outside and discuss them." She was buying time, creating a professional reason to interrupt whatever had been happening before she entered. Dr. Perez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I said that won't be necessary. I've made my observations, and will update the chart accordingly." He turned back to Paolo, his voice taking on an edge of finality. "Remember what we discussed, Mr. Oliveira. Cooperation is essential for your recovery." With that, he swept past Leona and out of the room, his white coat snapping behind him like a flag in a storm. The scent of expensive cologne lingered in his wake, incongruous in the antiseptic hospital air. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Leona busied herself, checking Paolo's vital signs again, giving him time to compose himself. When she finally looked up from the monitors, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear mixed with something else, perhaps hope. "Are you all right, Paolo?" she asked quietly, noting how his heart rate was slowly returning to normal. He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again, as if unsure which response was safer. "I'm fine," he managed finally, but his voice cracked on the words. "Just tired. Very tired." Leona pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down, making her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "You know," she said carefully, "part of my job is to make sure you're comfortable. Not just physically comfortable, but feeling safe and respected. If there's anything happening that makes you uncomfortable..." She let the sentence hang, giving him space to fill it. Paolo's eyes darted to the door, then back to her face, searching for something. Trust, perhaps, or protection. "I can't," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "He's a very important doctor, very respected. And I'm just..." He gestured vaguely at himself, the movement encompassing his age, his race, his current vulnerability. Leona felt something cold settle in her stomach, a mixture of anger and determination. She'd seen this before in other hospitals, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that power could be abused, how patients could be made to feel small and powerless in their most vulnerable moments. "Paolo," she said gently but firmly, "in this hospital, every patient deserves the same level of care and respect. No exceptions. If something is happening that shouldn't be, there are ways to address it. People who will listen." He met her eyes then, and she saw decades of accumulated wisdom and weariness in his gaze. "Are there?" he asked softly. "Are there really?" Before she could respond, the quiet was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, accompanied by the squeak of wheels. The night shift was bringing in a new admission, and duty called. Leona stood reluctantly, knowing she needed to help with the new patient. "I'll be back," she promised, touching Paolo's hand lightly. "Think about what I said. You're not alone here." As she left room 507, her mind was already racing, analyzing options and potential courses of action. She had 4 more hours left in her shift, and she intended to use them well. Something was very wrong on 5 West, and Leona Dorson had never been one to look the other way when her patients needed an advocate. The fluorescent lights continued their endless vigil overhead as she walked back to the nurse's station. But now they seemed less harsh, more like spotlights illuminating a path she knew she had to follow, regardless of the consequences. The night was far from over, and somewhere in the quiet corridors of Vora Medical Institute, justice was waiting to be served. The new admission turned out to be relatively straightforward, an elderly woman with concerning but stable cardiac symptoms. But Leona's thoughts remained fixed on room 507 as she helped settle the patient. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing down the dimly lit corridor, half expecting to see Dr. Perez's white coat ghosting through the shadows again. As she updated the new patient's chart, Leona began discreetly pulling up Dr. Perez's other cases, careful to maintain the appearance of routine documentation. The hospital's electronic medical record system was a labyrinth of interconnected data, but she had learned over years of temporary assignments how to navigate such systems efficiently. What she found made her blood run cold. Pattern after pattern emerged. Elderly minority patients experiencing complications during their stays, extended recovery times, pain medication administered at the outer limits of acceptable intervals. Nothing overtly criminal, nothing that would raise immediate red flags. But to an experienced nurse's eye, the picture was becoming disturbingly clear. "Burning the midnight oil, I see." The voice made her jump. Sarah Chun, one of the regular night nurses, had appeared beside her desk, holding 2 cups of coffee from the staff room. She offered one to Leona with a tired smile. "Thanks." Leona accepted the cup gratefully, minimizing the windows on her screen with casual precision. "Just trying to stay on top of the documentation." Sarah leaned against the desk, her dark eyes knowing. "I saw Perez was here earlier. Room 507. When Leona nodded, Sarah's expression tightened. "Yeah, he's been making a lot of night rounds lately, always with certain patients." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. Leona took a careful sip of coffee, studying her colleague's face. "How long have you worked here, Sarah?" "3 years," Sarah replied, her voice dropping slightly. "Long enough to see patterns. Long enough to file reports that somehow never make it past preliminary review." She straightened up, adjusting her scrubs with practiced efficiency. "But I'm just a nurse, right? What do I know compared to the great Dr. Perez?" The bitterness in her tone told volumes. Leona set her coffee down, thinking carefully about her next words. "Have other temps noticed anything?" Sarah's laugh was short and humorless. "Oh, plenty. But temps who ask too many questions don't last long here. There's always some reason: budget cuts, schedule changes, personality conflicts. The usual." A call light flashed on the board. Room 511 needed assistance. Sarah pushed off from the desk with a sigh. "Just be careful, okay? Some battles aren't worth fighting." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Even when they should be." As Sarah walked away, Leona turned back to her computer, but her mind was racing. The coffee grew cold beside her as she pieced together everything she'd observed. Paolo's fear, Dr. Perez's behavior, Sarah's warnings, the patterns in the medical records. The picture it painted was ugly, but clear. A soft sound drew her attention back to the corridor. Paolo was standing in his doorway, one hand gripping his four-pole for support. Even from a distance, she could see he was trembling with the effort of staying upright. "Paolo." Leona hurried to his side, quickly supporting his weight. "You shouldn't be up without assistance. What do you need?" His fingers clutched at her arm with surprising strength. I need to tell you something," he whispered, his voice shaking. "About Dr. Perez. About what he's been doing." Leona glanced quickly up and down the hallway. The ward was quiet, most patients asleep, but she knew how easily voices could carry in the hospital's acoustic architecture. "Let's get you back to bed first," she said gently. "Then we can talk." As she helped him back to his room, she could feel the tremors running through his thin frame, not just from physical exertion, she suspected, but from fear and determination. Once he was settled back in bed, his vital signs stabilized. Leona pulled the visitor's chair close and sat down. "Take your time," she said softly. "I'm listening." Paolo's hands twisted in the blanket as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. The story that emerged was one of systematic degradation, subtle threats masked as medical advice, accidental rough handling during examinations, racial slurs muttered just loud enough to hear, pain medication delayed with flimsy excuses. He said people like me are a drain on the system," Paolo's voice cracked. "That we take up beds that could go to more deserving patients. That if I complained, he could make sure my treatment became much more complicated." Leona felt her jaw tighten, anger burning in her chest. But she kept her voice calm, professional, as she asked, "How long has this been happening?" "Since I was admitted. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things. Being too sensitive." Paolo's eyes filled with tears. "But then I started hearing stories from other patients. Whispers. About others like me who had problems with their treatment. Who got worse instead of better after complaining." The monitor showed his heart rate climbing again. Leona reached out and took his hand, providing an anchor of human contact. "Paolo, what Dr. Perez is doing is wrong. It's unethical, it's discriminatory, and it's illegal. There are ways to stop this." "Are there?" The same question he'd asked earlier, but now with a desperate edge of hope. "He's powerful here. Connected. Who would believe?" "I would," Leona interrupted firmly. "I do. And I'm not the only one who's noticed." She thought of Sarah's words, of the other nurses who had seen but felt powerless to act. "But I need you to be brave. Can you tell this story again, officially? To people who can do something about it?" Paolo was silent for a long moment, his hand trembling in hers. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'm tired," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Tired of being afraid. Tired of being treated like I don't matter." Leona squeezed his hand gently. "You matter, Paolo. And what happens next is going to prove that." She stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind. "I'm going to make some calls. There are protocols for reporting abuse, channels that even Dr. Perez can't control. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw a spark of real hope in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. I trust you. As Leona stepped out of room 507, her hand was already reaching for her phone. The night shift was far from over, and what she was about to do would likely end her assignment at Vora Medical Institute. But as she looked back at Paolo, now sitting straighter in his bed despite his exhaustion, she knew with absolute certainty that she was making the right choice. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter now, as if illuminating the path before her with unflinching clarity. Sometimes, she reflected, justice needed more than just witnesses. It needed someone willing to step forward and shine a light into the darkness, regardless of the cost. With trembling fingers that belied her resolute mind, Leona dialed the hospital's compliance hotline. The automated message seemed to drone on endlessly before she finally reached a live operator. Each word she spoke felt like both a betrayal of the medical establishment she devoted her life to and a confirmation of everything she believed in. She detailed her observations, Paolo's testimony, and the patterns she discovered in Dr. Perez's cases, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. The operator's professional detachment began to crack as the story unfolded. Ms. Dorson, given the serious nature of these allegations, will need to involve hospital administration and possibly law enforcement. Are you prepared for what that might mean? I am, Leona responded without hesitation. But we need to move quickly. I'm concerned about potential retaliation. As if summoned by her words, the sharp click of expensive shoes on linoleum echoed down the corridor. Leona's heart jumped into her throat as she recognized the sound. She quickly ended the call, but not before extracting a promise of immediate action from the operator. Dr. Perez rounded the corner, his perfect composure somehow more menacing in the quiet hours of the night shift. His eyes locked onto Leona, and the pretense of professional courtesy dropped from his face like a discarded mask. Nurse Dorson, he said, his voice carrying the chill of surgical steel. I believe we need to have a discussion about professional boundaries. Leona straightened her spine, grateful for the solid weight of her phone in her pocket, the recorded conversation now safely logged in the hospital's compliance system. Of course, Dr. Perez. Would you prefer to have this discussion with hospital administration present? Something dangerous flickered across his features. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Let me be clear. You're a temporary nurse. Your contract can be terminated for any number of reasons. Professional references can be complicated. Are you certain you want to pursue whatever misguided crusade you're contemplating? Before Leona could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the corridor. Security officers were converging on the ward, accompanied by a woman in a tailored suit who moved with unmistakable authority. The night administrator, Leona realized with a surge of hope. Dr. Perez's face contorted with rage as he recognized what was happening. He spun toward Leona, all pretense of professionalism evaporating. You stupid little... Dr. Perez... The administrator's voice cut through the air like a scalpel. Step away from Nurse Dorson immediately. The security officers moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves between Leona and the doctor. The administrator, her badge identified her as Dr. Helena Martinez, approached with measured steps. We've received some very disturbing allegations, Dr. Martinez stated, her eyes hard as she assessed the situation. Allegations that unfortunately align with several previous reports that were mishandled. That ends tonight. Dr. Perez's laugh was ugly. You're going to take the word of a temporary nurse and a confused patient over mine? Do you know who I am? Who my connections are? Yes, Dr. Martinez replied coldly. We know exactly who you are, and we know what you've done. Mr. Oliveira is not your only victim, and Nurse Dorson is not your only witness. As if on cue, Sarah appeared at the nurse's station, accompanied by two other nurses Leona recognized from previous shifts. Behind them, more figures emerged from the shadows of the ward. Orderlies, technicians, support staff. The silent witnesses who had seen but felt powerless to speak until now. Your privileges at this hospital are suspended, effective immediately, Dr. Martinez continued. Security will escort you from the premises. The police have been notified, and they'll want to speak with you about several cases of suspected patient abuse. The security officers moved forward, but Dr. Perez jerked away from their reaching hands. "This is ridiculous. A witch hunt based on nothing but the complaints of human beings who deserved better than what you gave them," Leona interrupted, her voice steady. "Of patients who trusted you with their lives, and whom you betrayed because of your own prejudices." The doctor's face twisted into something ugly, his carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. "You self-righteous little—" He lunged forward, but the security officers were faster, catching his arms and restraining him as he struggled and shouted. As they led him away, his threats and protests echoing down the corridor, Leona felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Sarah standing beside her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "We've been trying to stop him for so long, but never had enough proof, enough courage." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her expression grave but approving. "Nurse Dorson, we'll need your full statement. And Mr. Oliveira's, if he's willing. This is going to be a long process, but it ends tonight." Leona nodded, already turning toward room 507. "I'll speak with Paolo. He's ready to tell his story." The rest of the night passed in a blur of statements and documentation. Paolo told his story with quiet dignity, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. Other patients, hearing the commotion, began to speak up as well. The dam had broken, and years of suppressed truth came flooding out. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Leona stood at the window of room 507, watching the first police cars arrive. Paolo had finally drifted off to sleep, his face more peaceful than she'd seen it since arriving on the ward. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly, joining her at the window. Leona watched as officers emerged from their vehicles, their presence marking the beginning of a new chapter in Vora Medical Institute's story. "Now we make sure this never happens again. We speak up, we stand firm, and we remember that every patient deserves dignity and respect." The morning shift would be arriving soon, and with it would come questions, investigations, and changes. But as Leona looked at Paolo's sleeping form, she knew that sometimes justice came not in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage, in choosing to stand up when others looked away, in refusing to accept that power meant immunity from consequences. The first rays of sunlight streaked across the floor of room 507, and with them came the promise of a new day, a better way, and the knowledge that one person's courage could light the way for others to follow. The morning shift change brought with it a palpable tension, an electric current of whispers and meaningful glances as the news of Dr. Perez's removal spread through the hospital like a vital medication coursing through and for line. Leona found herself at the center of it all, yet somehow removed, as if watching events unfold from behind a thin pane of glass. Detective Maria Santos arrived just as the sun had fully cleared the horizon, her badge catching the morning light as she introduced herself. Her dark eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing as she took in the scene on 5 West. "We'll need to speak with everyone involved," she explained, setting up in an empty conference room. "But first, Nurse Dorson, I'd like to hear your account. From the beginning." Leona glanced at the clock. Her shift had officially ended 2 hours ago, but time seemed to have lost all meaning. She sank into a chair across from the detective, gathering her thoughts. "It started with small things," she began, "the kind of details that might seem insignificant on their own." For the next 3 hours, Leona detailed everything she had observed, everything Paolo had shared, every pattern she had noticed in Dr. Perez's cases. Detective Santos took meticulous notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly letting Leona speak uninterrupted. "You understand," the detective said finally, "that this case will likely become very public. Dr. Perez has ions in the medical community, supporters who won't want to believe these allegations. Are you prepared for that?" Leona thought of Paolo, of the other patients who had begun to come forward, of Sarah and the other staff members who had lived with this knowledge for so long. "Yes," she answered simply. "Some things are worth fighting for." As if on cue, there was a knock at the conference room door. Sarah poked her head in, her face drawn with exhaustion, but determined. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Oliveira is asking for Leona. Well, you should come." Excusing herself from the detective, Leona hurried to room 507. She found Paolo sitting up in bed, surrounded by what appeared to be his entire family. An elderly woman who could only be his wife, adult children, and what looked like several grandchildren. They all turned to look at her as she entered. "There she is," Paolo said, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "This is the nurse I told you about, the one who listened." Before Leona could respond, Paolo's wife had engulfed her in a fierce hug. "Thank you," the older woman whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for protecting him when we couldn't." The next hour was a blur of introductions and tears, of stories shared and connections made. Paolo's family had noticed changes in him during his hospital stay, but hadn't understood the cause of his growing depression and anxiety. Now, as the full story emerged, their grief turned to determination. "We're filing a formal complaint," Paolo's eldest daughter, a lawyer, announced. "And we're not the only ones. 3 other families have already contacted me this morning. This stops here." Throughout the day, more stories emerged. Other patients, past and present, began coming forward. Staff members who had left the hospital years ago called in with their own accounts of Dr. Perez's behavior. What had started as one nurse's stand was becoming a movement. Hospital administration called an emergency staff meeting that afternoon. Leona, running on nothing but coffee and determination, sat in the back as Dr. Martinez addressed the packed auditorium. "What happened here represents a fundamental betrayal of everything we stand for as healthcare providers," the administrator declared. "But it also represents an opportunity to examine our systems, to strengthen our protections, to ensure that no patient ever feels powerless within these walls again." New policies were announced. Enhanced reporting procedures, anonymous feedback systems, regular reviews of patient outcomes data. But more importantly, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that speaking up was not just permitted but expected. As the meeting dispersed, Leona found herself surrounded by colleagues, nurses, technicians, orderlies, even doctors, all wanting to share their own stories, to express their support, to be part of the change. "You know," Sarah said as they walked back to 5 West together, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about some things being worth fighting for. Maybe that's what we all needed to remember." Leona nodded, thinking of all the small moments of courage that had led to this point. "Sometimes it just takes one person to break the silence," she replied. "Then others find their voices too." They reached room 507, where Paolo was resting after giving his official statement to the police. His family had reluctantly gone home to rest, promising to return that evening. He opened his eyes as Leona approached his bed. "I heard there was quite a meeting," he said, managing a small smile. "Things are really changing, aren't they?" "Yes," Leona answered, adjusting his blanket with the same care she'd shown that first night. "But change isn't always easy. There will be challenges ahead." Paolo reached out and caught her hand. "But we'll face them together, right? All of us who know the truth." "Together," Leona agreed, squeezing his hand gently. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of promise. On the ward, the usual sounds of hospital life continued. Monitors beeping, phones ringing, nurses and doctors going about their rounds. But there was something different now, a sense of awakening, of barriers being broken down and bridges being built. Detective Santos appeared in the doorway, her notebook in hand. "Ready for another round of questions? We're building quite a case." Leona looked at Paolo, who nodded firmly. "We're ready," he said, and his voice carried the strength of someone who had found not just his voice, but his power. As they began another session of testimony, Leona reflected on how much had changed in just 24 hours. One shift, one patient, one moment of choosing to stand up rather than look away. Sometimes that was all it took to start an avalanche of change. The sun continued its journey across the sky, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. But within the walls of Vora Medical Institute, a new light was dawning. The light of justice, of dignity restored, of voices finally being heard. In the days that followed, Vora Medical Institute underwent a transformation that went far beyond policy changes and new procedures. It was as if the hospital itself was healing from a long-hidden wound, each revelation bringing both pain and cleansing. Paolo's case became the catalyst for a larger investigation that spread through the hospital's departments like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dr. Martinez established an independent review board, bringing in medical ethicists and patient advocates from across the country. Their presence in the halls became a familiar sight. Professionals in business attire rather than medical scrubs, carrying tablets loaded with years of patient data. Leona found herself at the center of it all, though not in the way she'd expected. Rather than being ostracized as a whistleblower, she became a symbol of something larger: the power of individual conscience against systemic abuse. Other staff members began coming to her with their own observations and concerns, trusting her to help them navigate the new channels for reporting and accountability. "It's like a dam breaking," Sarah commented one evening as they shared coffee in the staff lounge. "All these years of silence, and now everyone wants to speak." The lounge itself had become a different place. Where once there had been careful silence and professional distance between different levels of staff, now there were open discussions, shared concerns, and a growing sense of common purpose. Even the doctors who had initially been defensive about the investigation were beginning to engage in meaningful dialogue about power dynamics and patient care. Paolo's recovery accelerated noticeably in the new atmosphere. With proper care and attention, free from the subtle torments he'd endured, his strength returned more quickly than anyone had expected. His room became a sort of unofficial headquarters for the change sweeping through the hospital. Families of other patients would stop by to share their stories. Staff members would pause to chat during their rounds, and even Dr. Martinez made regular visits to discuss the ongoing reforms. "You know what's funny?" Paolo said to Leona during one of her visits. She continued checking on him even after being assigned to different patients. "I keep thinking about how afraid I was to speak up, how I thought no one would believe me or care enough to act. And now look at all this." He gestured to the wall beside his bed, which had become covered with cards and letters, not just from his own family, but from other patients and their loved ones who had found the courage to share their own experiences. The media eventually caught wind of the story, of course. Local news vans began appearing outside the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking light. Dr. Martinez handled the press with remarkable grace, neither minimizing the severity of what had happened nor allowing the hospital's mission to be overshadowed by scandal. "Yes, terrible things happen here," she stated in one particularly memorable interview. "But what's more important is what happens next. How we learn, how we change, how we ensure that every patient who comes through our doors receives the care and respect they deserve." The ripple effect spread beyond Vora Medical Institute. Other hospitals in the region began reviewing their own policies and procedures. Medical associations called for increased attention to racial disparities in healthcare. Paolo's daughter, joining forces with other affected families, began working on legislation to strengthen patient protections and reporting mechanisms. Through it all, Leona continued her duties with the same quiet dedication that had first led her to notice something wrong in room 507. Her temporary contract was extended indefinitely, though several other hospitals had already reached out with job offers. Something about Vora felt unfinished, like a patient still needing care despite showing signs of recovery. 1 month after that fateful night shift, Leona arrived for work to find Paolo being discharged. He sat in a wheelchair by the nurse's station, surrounded by well-wishers, looking years younger than when she'd first met him. "I hear you're staying on," he said as she approached, his eyes twinkling with knowing warmth. "Someone needs to make sure all these changes stick," she replied, smiling as she helped gather his belongings. "Changes like these don't just disappear," Paolo's wife commented, her hand resting protectively on her husband's shoulder. "They become part of who we are, part of our story." As if to emphasize her words, a group of new nursing students passed by, their expressions eager and attentive as their instructor discussed patient advocacy and the importance of speaking up when something seems wrong. The hospital had already incorporated the lessons of Paolo's case into its training programs. Dr. Martinez appeared, her usual professional demeanor softened by genuine emotion as she bid Paolo farewell. "You've helped us become better," she told him simply. "All of you have." Her gaze included Leona, Sarah, and the growing circle of staff members who had gathered to see Paolo off. As Paolo's family wheeled him toward the elevator, a strange feeling settled over Leona. Not the closure she had expected, but something more like a beginning. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long rays across the hospital floors, highlighting the steady stream of people going about their daily work of healing and care. Sarah appeared at her side, ready to begin their shift. "You know what the best part is?" she asked, watching the elevator doors close on Paolo's smiling face. "What's that?" "We're not afraid anymore. Any of us." She gestured to the ward around them, where staff moved with new confidence and patients engaged openly with their caregivers. "That's what real healing looks like." Leona nodded, thinking of all the small moments of courage that had led to this point. A temporary nurse noticing something wrong, a patient finding his voice, a community choosing to stand together rather than look away. Sometimes the most profound changes started with the simplest of actions: choosing to see, choosing to speak, choosing to stand. The morning shift was beginning, bringing with it new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to provide the kind of care that every human being deserved. Leona picked up her first chart of the day, ready to continue the work that had become so much more than just a job. In room 507, now occupied by a new patient, the morning light painted patterns on the wall where Paolo's letters and cards had hung. But their message remained, woven into the very fabric of the hospital. Justice, like healing, was a continuous process sustained by the daily choices of those who believed in something better.